The full crime story of Ted Bundy, America's most notorious serial killer. Theodore Robert Bundy was born on November 24, 1946, at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont. His mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, was 22 and unmarried, a profound shame in that era. To hide the scandal, Ted's grandparents raised him as their own son, telling him Eleanor was his oldest sister. Ted grew up believing this lie. He didn't learn the truth about his parentage until he was an adult, a discovery that reportedly disturbed him deeply. His biological father's identity remains uncertain. Some records list a salesman named Lloyd Marshall. Bundy himself sometimes claimed his father was a sailor. Later psychological analysis suggested his illegitimacy and the family deception contributed to his fractured sense of identity. In 1951, Eleanor moved with Ted to Tacoma, Washington, where she married Johnny Bundy, a hospital cook who adopted Ted and gave him his surname. They had 4 more children together. By all outward appearances, Ted had a normal middle-class upbringing. But neighbors and relatives later recalled troubling signs. Ted showed an early fascination with knives. His aunt reported waking up surrounded by knives Ted had placed around her while she slept. He was only 3 years old. He was socially awkward, struggled to make friends, and was reportedly caught peeping through windows as a teenager. Bundy enrolled at the University of Puget Sound in 1965, then transferred to the University of Washington in 1966, where he studied Chinese. He was intelligent but directionless, changing majors multiple times. In 1967, he began dating Stephanie Brooks, a pseudonym, a wealthy, sophisticated young woman from California. She was his first serious girlfriend, and he became obsessed with her. When she ended the relationship in 1968, citing his immaturity and lack of ambition, Bundy was devastated. This rejection appeared to be a turning point. Over the next several years, Bundy reinvented himself. He became a psychology major, worked on political campaigns, volunteered at a crisis hotline, and was accepted to law school. He began dating Elizabeth Klopfer, often called Liz Kendall in accounts, a young divorcee who fell deeply in love with him. In 1973, Bundy reconnected with Stephanie Brooks. Now polished and confident, he won her back. She believed he'd changed. He proposed marriage. Then he stopped returning her calls. Bundy later admitted this was intentional revenge. He'd rebuilt himself specifically to reject her as she had rejected him. Around this same time, young women began disappearing in the Pacific Northwest. The killing begins Washington State, 1974. The first confirmed attack attributed to Bundy occurred on January 4, 1974. Karen Sparks, an 18-year-old student at the University of Washington, was beaten with a metal rod in her basement apartment while she slept. She survived but suffered permanent brain damage. On February 1, 1974, Linda and Healy, a 21-year-old psychology student and ski report announcer, vanished from her basement room near the UW campus. Her bed had been made, but her nightgown was blood-stained. She was never seen alive again. Over the following months, young women began disappearing at an alarming rate across Washington and Oregon. Times March 12, 1974, Donna Gail Manson, 19, vanished from Evergreen State College in Olympia. Times April 17, 1974, Susan Elaine Rancourt, 18, disappeared from Central Washington State College. Times May 6, 1974, Roberta Kathleen Parks, 20, vanished from Oregon State University. Times June 1, 1974, Brenda Carol Bull, 22, disappeared after leaving a tavern in Berrien, Washington. Times June 11, 1974, Georgianne Hawkins, 18, vanished from an alley behind her sorority house at the University of Washington, only 40 feet from the back door. The victims shared common characteristics: young, attractive, with long dark hair parted in the middle. Many resembled Stephanie Brooks. Lake Sammamish, July 14, 1974. This date marked a turning point in the investigation. At Lake Sammamish State Park, east of Seattle, a handsome young man with his arm in a sling approached multiple women asking for help loading a sailboat. At least 5 women refused or were pulled away by friends. 2 were not so fortunate. Janice OTT, 23, was last seen leaving with the man, who introduced himself as Ted. She told a friend she was going to help him load a sailboat at his parents' house. Denise Naslund, 19, disappeared from the same park hours later. For the first time, investigators had a name, Ted, and a description, attractive, well-spoken, driving a tan Volkswagen Beetle. The composite sketch was broadcast widely. Elizabeth Klopfer, Bundy's girlfriend, saw the sketch and the name. She called the police tip line to report her suspicions about her boyfriend. So did a co-worker and a psychology professor who knew him. Ted Bundy's name was added to a list of over 3,000 suspects. He was considered low priority, a law student with no criminal record and strong references. In March 1975, forestry students discovered human remains on Taylor Mountain, east of Seattle. The skulls and bones of Linda and Healy, Susan Rancourt, Roberta Parks, and Brenda Ball were recovered. 2 months later, the remains of Janice OTT and Denise Naslund were found on another hillside, along with an extra femur belonging to an unidentified victim. The bones showed signs of animal scavenging. Some skulls had been cleaned and kept, possibly as trophies. In September 1974, Bundy enrolled at the University of Utah Law School in Salt Lake City. The disappearances in Washington stopped. In Utah, they began. Times October 2nd, 1974, Nancy Wilcox, 16, vanished in Holiday, Utah. Times October 18th, 1974, Melissa Smith, 17, the daughter of a local police chief, disappeared in Midvale. Her body was found 9 days later in the mountains. She had been strangled and beaten. Times October 31st, 1974, Laura Aim, 17, vanished from a Halloween party in Lehi. Her body was found a month later in a canyon. Times November 8th, 1974, Carol Deeranch, 18, was approached at a shopping mall by a man claiming to be a police officer. He lured her into his car, then attacked her with a crowbar. She fought back and escaped, the first known survivor to provide a detailed account. That same night, Deborah Kent, 17, disappeared from a high school auditorium in Bountiful. A handcuff key was found in the parking lot. Colorado, 1975. In January 1975, Karen Campbell, 23, vanished from a ski resort in Snowmass, Colorado. Her body was found a month later. Over the following months, several more young women disappeared in Colorado. Times Julie Cunningham, 26, from Vail. Times Denise Oliver's son, 25, from Grand Junction. Times Melanie Cooley, 18, from Nederland. Investigators across 3 states began to suspect the cases were connected. A multi-state task force formed. August 16, 1975. In the early morning hours, a Utah Highway Patrol sergeant named Bob Hayward spotted a Volkswagen Beetle driving slowly through a residential neighborhood in Granger, Utah. When Hayward flashed his lights, the driver fled. After a brief chase, Hayward pulled over the car. The driver was Ted Bundy. A search of the vehicle revealed times a ski mask, times a crowbar, times handcuffs, times trash bags, times an ice pick, times rope. Bundy claimed the items were for everyday use. He was arrested for evading police and released on bail. Detectives brought Carol Deeranch to view a lineup. She identified Ted Bundy as the man who had attacked her. On February 23, 1976, Bundy was convicted of aggravated kidnapping. He was sentenced to 1 to 15 years in Utah State Prison. But Colorado authorities had been building a case. In October 1976, Bundy was charged with the murder of Karen Campbell and transferred to Aspen, Colorado, to stand trial. June 7, 1977. During a pretrial hearing at the Pitkin County Courthouse, Bundy was allowed to visit the courthouse library to research his case. He asked to go unshackled, arguing he was acting as his own attorney. When the deputy turned away, Bundy jumped from a second-story window. He landed hard, spraining his ankle, but managed to escape into the mountains. For 6 days, he evaded capture, breaking into cabins for food and shelter. He was recaptured attempting to steal a car, weakened from exposure and hunger. December 30th, 1977. Bundy was transferred to the Glenwood Springs jail to await trial. Over several months, he acquired a hacksaw blade and $500 in cash. He lost approximately 35 pounds to fit through a small opening. On the night of December 30th, Bundy climbed through a 12-inch square hole he had carved in the ceiling of his cell. He crawled through the space above, dropped into a closet in the chief jailer's apartment, who was out for the evening, and walked out the front door wearing civilian clothes. By the time guard discovered he was missing 17 hours later, Bundy had stolen a car and driven to Denver, then boarded a flight to Chicago. He traveled by train to Ann Arbor, Michigan, then stole another car and drove to Atlanta, and finally took a bus to Tallahassee, Florida. He was a free man, 1,000 miles from anyone who knew his face. January 15th, 1978. At approximately 3 a.m., Bundy entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University in Tallahassee through an unlocked back door. He was carrying a wooden club, a piece of oak firewood. In less than 15 minutes, he attacked 4 sleeping women. Times Margaret Bowman, 21, was beaten and strangled with a nylon stocking. She died. Times Lisa Levi, 20, was beaten, strangled, sexually assaulted, and bitten. She died. Times Kathy Kleiner was beaten, suffering a broken jaw and deep lacerations. She survived. Times Karen Chandler was beaten, suffering a concussion, broken jaw, and lost teeth. She survived. Bundy then left the sorority house and walked 8 blocks to a duplex, where he attacked Cheryl Thomas, a student. She suffered skull fractures and permanent hearing loss but survived. 5 women attacked in a single night. 2 dead. The survivors' accounts were fragmentary. They had been awakened from sleep by sudden violence. A witness, Nita Nee, saw a man leaving the sorority house carrying a club. She provided a description. February 9th, 1978. 3 weeks later, Bundy abducted 12-year-old Kimberly Leach from her junior high school in Lake City, Florida, approximately 150 miles from Tallahassee. She was the youngest of his known victims. Her body was found 2 months later in an abandoned pig shed. February 15th, 1978. At 1 a.m., Pensacola police officer David Lee stopped a Volkswagen Beetle for a routine check. The driver gave a false name, but Lee grew suspicious. When he ran the license plate, it came back stolen. Bundy attacked Officer Lee and attempted to flee. Lee fired at him, and Bundy surrendered. Ted Bundy was in custody for the last time. Trial and judgment. The Chi Omega trial, June-July 1979. Bundy's trial in Miami was the first in American history to be televised nationally, drawing enormous public attention. Bundy insisted on serving as his own attorney, though he had counsel at his side. He was flamboyant, charming the courtroom and cameras. Some observers were disturbed by how normal he appeared. The evidence against him was substantial. Times eyewitness testimony. Nita Nee identified Bundy as the man she saw leaving Chi Omega. Times forensic evidence. A bite mark on Lisa Levy's body matched Bundy's dental impressions, one of the first uses of forensic odontology in a murder trial. Times fiber evidence. Fibers from his clothing were found at the scene. On July 24, 1979, the jury found Bundy guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. During the penalty phase, in a bizarre courtroom moment, Bundy called Carolyn Boone, a woman who had befriended him and believed in his innocence, to the stand. Using an obscure Florida law that allowed courtroom declarations to serve as legal marriage, Bundy proposed to her on the witness stand. She accepted. The jury recommended death. Judge Edward Cowart sentenced Bundy with these words: "It is ordered that you be put to death by a current of electricity. That current be passed through your body until you are dead. Take care of yourself, young man. I say that to you sincerely. Take care of yourself. It is a tragedy for this court to see such a total waste of humanity. You'd have made a good lawyer. I would have loved to have you practice in front of me. But you went another way, partner." The Kimberly Leach trial, January 1980. A second trial for the murder of Kimberly Leach resulted in another death sentence. This time, Bundy's defense attempted an insanity plea. The jury rejected it. Death row confessions. Years on death row, 1980 to 1989. Bundy spent nearly a decade on Florida's death row, exhausting appeal after appeal. During this time, Carolyn Boone visited him regularly. In 1982, she gave birth to a daughter, believed to be Bundy's, conceived during a conjugal-style visit, though Florida officially prohibited such visits. As execution dates approached and were stayed, Bundy began reaching out to investigators. He hinted that he would reveal more about his crimes in exchange for stays of execution. The final confessions. In his final days, with no more appeals remaining, Bundy began to confess in earnest. Detectives from multiple states traveled to Florida to interview him. He admitted to at least 30 murders across Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, Idaho, California, and Florida. He provided details only the killer would know: where bodies were buried, what victims wore, how he had approached them. Some key revelations. Times he admitted to returning to his dump sites to engage in necrophilia with victims' remains. Times he acknowledged keeping severed heads as trophies in his apartment. Times he confessed to murders that had never been definitively linked to him, including in Idaho and California. Times he suggested the true number was significantly higher than 30, though he never provided a definitive count. Many investigators believe the real number may exceed 100 victims, given gaps in his timeline and unsolved disappearances that fit his pattern. January 24, 1989. At 7 a.m., Theodore Robert Bundy was strapped into Florida's electric chair, nicknamed Old Sparky. Outside the prison, a crowd of approximately 500 people had gathered, many celebrating with signs reading "Burn, Bundy, Ben, and Tuesday is Friday." Some set off fireworks. Bundy's final words were directed at his attorney Jim Coleman and Methodist minister Fred Lawrence. "Jim and Fred, I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." At 7:16 a.m., Ted Bundy was pronounced dead. He was 42 years old. The confirmed death toll stands at 30 victims, but many families still await closure. Remains of several victims, including Donna Manson and Susan Curtis, have never been recovered. Bundy's victims were daughters, sisters, friends, and students, young women whose lives were cut short by a predator who looked like the boy next door. Bundy's case transformed criminal investigation. Times 6 Cap, violent criminal apprehension program. His ability to evade detection across state lines highlighted the need for a national database linking violent crimes. Times Forensic Odontology. The bite mark evidence in the Chi Omega trial helped establish dental analysis as a forensic tool. Times Criminal Profiling. Bundy became a subject of FBI behavioral analysis, contributing to the development of serial killer profiling. Times Victim Awareness. His methods: feigning injury, impersonating authority figures, exploiting trust, became widely publicized warnings. Bundy was diagnosed by various experts as having antisocial personality disorder, what was then called sociopathy. He displayed classic traits: times superficial charm and intelligence, times lack of genuine empathy or remorse, times pathological lying, times grandiose sense of self-worth, times need for stimulation and tendency toward boredom, times failure to accept responsibility. In his final interviews, Bundy attempted to blame pornography for his crimes, a claim most experts dismissed as a final manipulation. Robert Keppel, the detective who pursued Bundy for years, summarized him simply: he was a predator. He hunted human beings for the thrill of the hunt and the pleasure of the kill.
David Lee 3 days later at around 1 a.m. after a wants and warrants check revealed his Volkswagen Beetle had been stolen. Bundy kicked Lee's legs out from under him and fled after learning he was being arrested. Lee chased after him and tackled him after firing 2 warning bullets. Before the officer managed to overpower and arrest Bundy, the two engaged in a battle for Lee's gun. 3 sets of female FSU student IDs, 21 stolen credit cards, and a stolen television were all found in the stolen car. The disguise used by Richard Burton Fire Department in Jacksonville was later determined to be a pair of plaid slacks and a pair of dark-rimmed non-prescription glasses that were also discovered. Unaware that he had just apprehended one of the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives, Lee was transporting his suspect to jail when he overheard Bundy saying, "I wish you had murdered me." In June 1979, Bundy was put on trial for the Chi Omega murders and assaults after the trial's location was changed to Miami. The trial was the first to be broadcast nationwide on American television and was covered by 250 reporters from 5 different countries. Although 5 court-appointed counsels were present, Bundy handled most of his defense once more. He sabotaged the entire defense effort from the beginning out of spite, distrust, and grandiose delusion, Nelson later remarked. Ted was accused of murder and could receive the death penalty, but all that mattered to him, it seemed, was being in command. A pre-trial plea agreement was reached, according to Mike Minerva, a Tallahassee public defender and defense team member, in which Bundy would admit to killing Levy, Bowman, and Leach in exchange for a set sentence of 75 years in prison. According to one report, prosecutors were open to a compromise since they had a very strong chance of losing at trial. Bundy, on the other hand, considered the plea agreement as a tactical maneuver that would allow him to submit his plea and then wait a few years for witnesses to pass away, move on, or recant their testimony, as well as for evidence to break down or go missing. He may pursue a post-conviction request to throw aside the plea and get an acquittal once the prosecution's case against him has deteriorated beyond repair. But at the last minute, Bundy rejected the offer. He realized that he would have to confess his crime in front of everyone, Minerva added. He just wasn't able to accomplish it. Chi Omega sorority members Connie Hastings, who located Bundy in the area of the sorority house that evening, and Nita Neary, who saw him leave home holding the murder weapon, both provided significant testimony during the trial. The impressions of the bite mark Bundy left on Levy's left buttock, which forensic odontologists Richard Souviron and Lowell Levine matched to castings of Bundy's teeth, were among the physically incriminating items of evidence. On July 24, 1979, the jury found Bundy guilty of the murders of Bowman and Levy, 3 charges of attempted first-degree murder for the assaults on Kleiner, Chandler, and Thomas, and 2 counts of burglary after deliberating for less than 7 hours. For the murder convictions, trial judge Edward Cowart handed death sentences. A second trial for Leach's kidnapping and murder was held in Orlando 6 months later. After less than 8 hours of deliberation, Bundy was found guilty once more, primarily because of the evidence of an eyewitness who observed him escorting Leach to his stolen van from the schoolyard. Clothing fibers with a unique manufacturing flaw were discovered in the van and on Leach's body. These fibers matched those from Bundy's jacket when he was apprehended. Bundy took advantage of an obscure Florida rule that said that a marriage statement made in court, in the presence of a judge, constituted a valid marriage during the punishment phase of the Leach trial. He proposed to her as he was questioning Boone, who had relocated to Florida to be close to Bundy, had testified in support of him during both trials, and was now testifying as a character witness. She agreed, and Bundy informed the judge that their marriage was valid. On February 10, 1980, Bundy received a 3rd electrocution death sentence. He reportedly stood when the verdict was read and said, tell the jury they were incorrect. It would be almost 9 years after this third death sentence was actually executed. Boone gave birth to Rose in October 1981 and identified Bundy as the father. While conjugal visits were prohibited at the Florida State Prison at Rayford, where Ted Bundy was held, it was common knowledge for prisoners to band together and pay the guards to grant them private time with their female guests. Bundy began a series of interviews with Stephen Michaud and Hugh Ainsworth soon after the Leach trial ended and the protracted appeals process got underway. He started disclosing information about his crimes and mental processes for the first time, primarily speaking in the third person to avoid the stigma of confession. When Bundy described his career as a thief, Klüpfer's long-held hunch that he had stolen almost everything of value from him was confirmed. "The biggest reward for me," he continued, "was really having what I had taken. I thoroughly loved possessing something that I had sought out and gotten. Possession was a significant factor in both rape and murder cases." He claimed that sexual assault satisfied his desire to completely possess his victims. He initially murdered his victims as a matter of convenience, to eliminate the prospect of being caught. However, later on, murder became a part of the adventure. He claimed that taking a life was the ultimate possession. The actual possession of the remains follows. Bundy also shared information with FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit Special Agent William Hagmaier. Hagmaier was astounded by Bundy's deep, even supernatural delight from killing. Hagmaier recalled, he explained that after a while, murder is not only a crime of lust or violence. It takes possession of it. The places where you kill them or leave them to become precious to you, and you will always be pulled back to them. They are part of you. The victim becomes a part of you. Bundy informed Hagmaier that he initially saw himself as an impulsive and amateur killer before transitioning into what he called his prime or predator phase around the time of Healy's murder in 1974. Despite the fact that he never officially acknowledged killing, this meant that he started doing it well before 1974. 2 hacksaw blades were concealed in Bundy's cell when prison authorities searched it in July 1984. One of the cell's windows had a steel bar that had been entirely sawed through at the top and bottom and put back in with homemade soap-based glue. When guards discovered an illicit mirror a few months later, Bundy was sent to a new cell. Shortly after, he was accused of a disciplinary offense for having unapproved correspondence with John Hinckley Jr., a notorious felon. With an attempt to aid in the continuing search in Washington for the Green River Killer, subsequently identified as Gary Ridgway, Bundy got in touch with Keppel in October 1984 and offered to impart his alleged knowledge of serial killer psychology. Bundy was interviewed by Keppel and Green River Task Force detective Dave Reichert, but Ridgway evaded capture for an additional 17 years. After working with Michaud on another analysis of the interview materials, Keppel produced a thorough description of the Green River interviews. The Chi Omega convictions were scheduled for death on March 4, 1986. The U.S. Supreme Court provided a brief stay, but the execution was swiftly rescheduled. The full extent of Bundy's crimes, including what he did to some of his victims after they died, were ultimately revealed to Hagmaier and Nelson in April, just after the new date, July 2nd, was announced. He said that he frequently returned to the secondary murder scenes of Taylor Mountain, Issaquah, and other locations to lie with his victims and engage in sexual activities with their bodies before putrefaction forced him to stop. In some instances, he spent the entire night while driving several hours each way. In Utah, he constantly washed Amy's hair and put cosmetics on Smith's dead face. He told Hagmaier, "If you've got time, they can be anything you want them to be." He used a hacksaw to cut off the skulls of perhaps 12 of his victims, and at least one group of the severed heads, likely the 4 later discovered on Taylor Mountain, Rancourt, Parks, Ball, and Healy, was kept in his apartment before being disposed of. Less than 15 hours before the scheduled July 2nd execution, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals stayed it indefinitely. It remanded the Chi Omega case for review on a number of technicalities, including Bundy's capacity to stand trial and a mistaken instruction by the trial judge during the penalty phase requiring the jury to decide between life in prison and the death penalty, that in the end were never resolved. The Leach sentence was then scheduled to be executed on November 18th. On November 17th, the 11th Circuit Court issued a stay. Despite the dissents of Justices Thurgood Marshall and William J. Brennan, Jr., the Supreme Court declined to revisit the 11th Circuit's decision against Bundy in December 1988. After that last refusal, a firm execution date of January 24, 1989, was declared shortly after. For a case involving capital murder, Bundy's progress through the appellate courts had been extraordinarily quick. Contrary to common assumption, Bundy was hurried through the legal system as quickly as possible. Even the prosecutors admitted that Bundy's attorneys never used delay strategies. Even though Ted Bundy's execution appeared to be taking longer than expected, Ted Bundy was actually close to being executed. After exhausting all appeals, Bundy decided to be open and honest with the authorities because he had no reason to continue to try to cover up his crimes. He admitted to Keppel that he was responsible for all 8 of the murders in Oregon and Washington for which he was the main suspect. He described 2 more fatalities in Oregon and 2 more in Washington who were previously unknown, if indeed he ever knew their identities. He claimed that Manson's body was the 6th, but her head was burned in Klopfer's fireplace. Keppel remarked, "He detailed the Issaquah murder scene, and it was almost as if he had just been there. Ott, Naslund, and Hawkins's bones were discovered there. As if he could see everything. He spent so much time there that he was enamored with the idea. Simply said, he is always completely preoccupied with murder." Nelson had similar thoughts. The blatant misogyny of his actions, as well as his obvious rage against women, astounded her, she noted. He had no empathy at all since he was so preoccupied with the facts. His life's work consisted of killings. Bundy admitted to committing multiple further homicides, including several that the police were unaware of, to detectives from Idaho, Utah, and Colorado. He explained that he could bring his victims back to his apartment in Utah so that he could reenact scenes from detective magazine covers. It didn't take long for a new ulterior plan to become clear. By withholding key information, he hoped to secure yet another stay of execution. He acknowledged, "There are more buried bones in Colorado," but he made no further comment. The new plan, which was quickly called Ted's Bones for Time plot, did little to provide fresh specific information and instead strengthened the authorities' desire to see Bundy killed on schedule. When he provided specifics, nothing was discovered. Colorado investigator Matt Lindvall saw this as a contradiction between the killer's wish to maintain complete possession, the only person who knew his victims' exact resting places, and his desire to delay his execution by disclosing information. Bundy's supporters started pushing for the only available option, executive clemency, after it became evident that the courts would grant no additional stays. To allow Bundy time to provide further details, Diana Weiner, a young Florida lawyer and Bundy's final rumored love interest, requested that the relatives of many Colorado and Utah victims petition Florida Governor Bob Martinez for a postponement. According to Nelson, the families already thought the victims were dead, and Ted had killed them. They were not in need of his admission. Martinez made it clear that he would not consent to any additional delays. He told reporters, "We will not allow the system to be corrupted. It's terrible that he would bargain for his life over the victims' bodies." Boone defended Bundy's innocence during each of his trials and felt very betrayed by his admission of guilt. On the morning of his execution, she returned to Washington with her daughter and declined to take his call. According to Nelson, his friendship with Diana Weiner harmed her, and she was devastated by his unexpected, sweeping disclosures in his final days. During Bundy's final discussions with detectives, Hagmaier was there. He spoke of suicide on the night before his execution. According to Hagmaier, he did not want to give the state the gratification of witnessing him die. On January 24, 1989, at 7:16 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, Bundy was put to death in the Rayford electric chair. His final words were, "Jim and Fred, I'd like you to offer my love to my family and friends," spoken to his lawyer Jim Coleman and Methodist pastor Fred Lawrence. Hundreds of people celebrated as the white hearse carrying Bundy's body left the prison as they sang, danced, and lit fireworks in a pasture across from the prison as the execution was carried out. In accordance with his wishes, he was cremated in Gainesville, and his ashes were dispersed at an undisclosed place in the Cascade Range of Washington state.